Признаюсь, я антрополог, но не буду я, не хочу, I will not proselytize. I don't want to convert anybody. I just want to speak about one small aspect of methodology for socio-cultural and linguistic anthropologists, ethnography. And excuse me, I will speak in my native language, English. So, I've noticed in the US since the 1990s, for some reason, the appeal and the prestige of anthropology, especially of ethnographic methods, has risen across disciplines which once dismissed anthropology as too touchy-feely, as too interpretive, as too soft. So especially political scientists, sociologists, economists have begun to appropriate ethnographic methods. I think perhaps one reason for this is directly because of what happened in this country when the political scientists and the economists and the Slavicists could not predict regime changes in this country. And so I think for that reason, many of our colleagues in other disciplines wanted to turn to observation of the real and understanding of ethnography. So whatever the cause, I've noticed in the last decade that ethnographic methods have been increasingly appropriated not only by these other disciplines, but also by corporations, by NGOs, and now by the military with the Human Terrain Project. Apparently, ethnography seems to promise to return encounters with real people to methodology. But I want to argue here, I want to warn against this, what looks to be a wholesale appropriation of ethnography. Because it doesn't always happen in a humanizing way, whatever that term means. Now, on anthropology's side, watching corporations co-opt simplified notions of national cultures and pass off a few interviews here and there as ethnography, many anthropologists have become cynical about the prospects of what might be called face-to-face methodologies. And what I do want to argue along with them that certainly interaction alone, encounter alone, is not enough to understand social fields of motivations, meanings, or of processes that produce agency or constraint. Still, I think that our reaction, our worry about appropriation of anthropology is itself a bit too much predicated on our appropriation of humanist philosophies in the decades before. So specifically, we anthropologists have become, since the 80s, a bit too comfortable with postmodernist ontological commitments to rupture. And here I might as well just note the absent presence in my sentence of Derrida. So I think we've come to become a bit too agnostic about the possibility for communication across what we term, or what people often term, a gap or a boundary. And we take on faith that meaning can never really cross the gap between subjectivities, and that boundaries between kinds actually exist. So though, as you all know here, people imagine connections, and we imagine communities, we imagine nations, but so too do we invent breaks and intervals, and the measures and scales that indicate gaps. So really, perhaps there is no gap between signifier and signified. There are no gaps between words and things, between mind and mind. The gap is a trope, another trope among tropes, and we manage it in particular ways through particular institutions. So, what I want to do today is demonstrate this possibility by looking at tropes, looking at images of breach, of gap, and also of contact, especially intersubjective contact, what is supposed to happen in the ethnographic encounter. And in doing that, I want to start with a textual method and juxtapose it to a historical method, and then finally end with, hopefully a more ethnographic method. And I tried to bring them into a useful conversation that might say something about what humanists can have to say to anthropologists. So I begin with a text about gaps, and then turn to a historian's account of making a text about gaps that in turn widened political gaps. And then I want to turn to an ethnographic encounter where people were puzzling about how to make sense of contact and breach of contact. All right, so now it's just story time. So I will begin with a text by the daughter of American anthropologist Louis Kroger, another child of an anthropologist. Her name was Ursula Le Guin. She was a science fiction writer who wrote in the 60s, 70s, 80s. In 1974, she wrote a novel titled The Dispossessed. The novel opens on a stony, desert, dry desert socialist moon that has severed almost all connection with the capitalist mother planet. On the moon, a single-walled spaceport channels a trickle of trade and censored mail. There's a scientist on the moon, a physicist, and he is stalled in his career. And he's stalled because since his boyhood, since his childhood, he has been obsessing over a forbidden riddle. And the riddle is this: if one takes a stone and throws it at a tree, then one can have its trajectory at each point along the way at ever smaller scales to an infinity of micro gaps between subparticles. So if that's so, how do we know if the stone ever really touches the tree? Is there ever contact? So the physicist, of course, he's working through one of Zeno's paradoxes. Here it's a paradox called dichotomy. It's a paradox which Zeno posed as a thought experiment meant to expose the conventions and metaphors that warped, at his time, scientific inquiry. Now, Zeno's point was not that stones never touch trees, but that the conventions of dividing space and time into units and points render an illusory understanding of movement, one that ultimately, if he was right, leads to a figuration of scientific method as one that denies sensation as evidence. Okay, so this problem is troubling the socialist science fiction physicist on this planet. Sorry, he's on the moon. And he writes about it and publishes and sends some of that to the capitalist mother planet. And to the dismay of his envious colleagues on the moon, the scientists on the capitalist planet appreciate his formula. And they even award him a cash prize. And he manages to acquire permission to travel to receive it. So he goes to visit the mother planet. And once there, they give him his honorarium, and he learns the sensation of the crispness of cash money. He learns the softness of silk fabric, he takes a shower and weeps under the heavy wetness of streaming, unrationed water. Because, of course, back on the moon, his living quarters had been Spartan, the landscape gray and monochrome. All right, so Le Guin, daughter of an American anthropologist, 1974, is, of course, echoing the many fictions in the West that argued for the moral superiority of capitalism. She's echoing them, but she subverts them. Because in most of the other stories, the traveler from the socialist world is overwhelmed when they get to the capitalist world, like him, like the physicist, by sensory plenitude. They're dazzled by things. But in those stories, for instance, in Hollywood, Silk Stockings, the character Ninochka, she arrives in Paris and she tries to maintain indifference to materials, but ultimately she goes shopping and she purchases silk dresses and stockings, and these sensations open her heart to human contact, finally. She learns to consume and she becomes human through contact. She softens herself, she discovers the true colors of romantic love, and so on and so on. Now, Le Guin's hero, by contrast, he follows quite a different arc, And his experiences of touching so many different materials does not resolve for him this problem of contact, and instead it compounds it. He's stumbling against materials and words and faces that engage his senses in new concatenations, and all these conflicting sensations, right? The stoniness of one person's gaze seems to confound the softness of their voice, and all of this messes up his sense of what contact, what human contact is, and whether or not it can take place. Now, the presence of these two very different texts, of course, underscores the possibility that the way they figure gaps are not just given. The gaps are not given, they're not simply there to be described, but they're brought into being by particular intersections of social ideas, ontologies about social materiality and semiosis, politics of these things. So, in order to illustrate that further, I want to move to another text, but one that we can trace not just as fictional, but one that we can also, thanks to a historian, anchor to its particular social and political encounters in which it was written and from which it became performative later. This text, I think also it came to shape a new division which we came to call the Iron Curtain, insofar as it was taken up as a reliable, almost ethnographic-like description of others and of the gap between us and them. So now I'm talking about George Kennan's long telegram, which, as you'll remember, was the description of Russian Soviet culture that he sent back to Washington in the late 40s, in which he wrote, quote unquote, "The traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity," unquote, would never allow the United States to penetrate their quote unquote Oriental secrecy. Okay, now Kennan wrote that text after having spent 2 long diplomatic stints here in Moscow in the mid-1930s and then again in the mid-1940s. So the problem is not that he never had contact, that he never observed. In the early 30s, he was still known to be an admirer of all things Russian. And in his early diaries and missives home, he put special emphasis on Russian capacity for human contact. But after the war, everything changed. And I'm relying here on historian Frank Castiglia, who read the boxes of diplomatic correspondence. Now, Castiglia argues that Kennan shifted his view not because he came more closely to observe Soviet people in their everyday lives as an ethnographer, but because he projected his own sense of alienation and his own disappointment with material contact with the world onto his observations of post-war Moscow. What happened, according to Castiglia, is that upon returning to Moscow after World War II, Kennan found that the exuberant 1930s embassy parties were canceled. In the 1930s, these parties had been replete with salted caviar, buoyant ballerinas, scratchy kisses from Stalin himself. After the war, all of these sensations are replaced by saltless bread, gloomy staff, and scratchy sheets. Sociality and commensality with the Muscovites had lost their ease. Now, in hindsight, with knowledge of the devastation and trauma of the war, it's difficult for us to understand how Kennan lacked the ability to see the given circumstances, such as a very pressing post-war, all of these post-war material restraints on hospitality. Moreover, the fact that his interactions covered at least a long period as good ethnography might didn't in any way make him more reflexive about how embassy rules against fraternizing with local people had always shaped and constrained his relationships. But the implication of all this is that US policy at the beginning of the Cold War, namely containment, was motivated by diplomats who projected onto so-called Soviet Russian national character their own frustration with barriers to contact, gaps which they themselves participated in creating in the first place. So, could anthropologists do any better? Could ethnography do any better? If Cold War ideologies and institutions or their traces continue to warp perceptions even of long-term interaction, how can I possibly recommend a method such as ethnography to rehumanize the humanities? And I don't. Ethnography alone, no. But anthropology as it is now, perhaps, in those moments when it engages actively with humanist theory, yes. Ethnography that does not engage with texts, networks, structures, events, and theory beyond the here and now of the ethnographic situation might as well just stay home. So it has to already have been hybrid as anthropology for it to be of any use, I think, even to anthropologists. So now I want to turn to something we might call an ethnographic encounter that I've been trying to make sense of for about a decade now. This comes from fieldwork that I conducted here in Moscow at a place called GITIS. It's an institute for training actors and directors. You probably know it. It's a very interesting institution because it's a place where young people train 7 days a week, 11 hours a day. They're learning conventions to not so much create realism, that's out, that's old, but conventions to make and break contact across proscenium gaps. So that's what they're training in. They're training in what you might call what Jakobson would have called the phatic function, which, as you'll recall for Jakobson, the referential function directs our attention to semantic reference of words, while the poetic function draws attention to their form. The phatic function draws attention to the very efficacy of media and the bare existence of contact. So, hello, can you hear me? Ты меня слышишь? Слышишь? Да. Нет, не слышит. Phatic function, all right? So, from the beginning of their training, the first-year students at GITIS run drills, tactile group exercises, conditioning them to open up to each other, to make contact, to feel when and where contact has been broken. One such exercise that I observed as an ethnographer was called vrak ili drug, friend or foe. So I could make you play, I suppose, right now. We should pick a volunteer. No, it would take too long. So I'll describe it. So say, for instance, we take Sergei, put him in the middle, you're standing in the middle, and we all stand around you. Yeah, we're all standing around you in a circle. And you go and turn to each person, and you are like one word only. You can shake the hand, and you can say, "Привет," and they can say back to you, "Привет," and that's it. And we're not to try, we in our heads decide, am I druk or am I vrak? And I say it to myself, but I don't try to show it to you, because, in life, people hide these things, as the instructor told them. Right. So you have one word, and you go around, and you shake our hands, and try to tell, are they friend or enemy, okay? So, yeah, do one. So, friend or enemy? Okay. So, alright, so imagine yourselves in a situation. You can keep doing it as long as you're like, this poor student, the first time we run this exercise, this poor student, she couldn't tell, and she goes around twice, can I repeat? Yes, okay, alright. She keeps going around, привет. She's almost in hysterics. She sends everybody almost to the side of vrak. And so she's shooting them one by one, and they fall to the ground, and each one almost declares as they fall, "Как я тебя любила." So she's getting it wrong, and so meanwhile the instructors are laughing, right? And one of them, I'm standing to the side, and the instructor's laughing, and here's the moment I'm trying to interpret. He says to me, shaking with laughter, he says to me, "Ну-ка, смотрите, это паранойя наш, советский, сталинский менталитет." What am I to do with this? What am I to do with this thing that he says in this moment to me? If I'm simply an ethnographer content with reporting on the here and now locally, I could present this as evidence for some kind of argument about how those Russians communicate. And believe me, I've led tour groups where people want to argue this and say, look, they're not smiling. Look at that, this kind of argument. It would be an attractive argument for a lot of people because it dovetails all too well with claims, even local claims, that, for instance, Soviet-era modes of communicating chilled the space between souls. I'm not happy with that. I'm not happy with that sort of ethnography. Perhaps ethnography attentive to the pragmatics of speaking could go further and unpack this moment to illustrate how specifically Moscow theatrical practitioners craft ideologies about communicating, and then hopefully insist that we investigate the stakes involved when speaking about our mentality to foreigners is at stake. This might render a tight argument as well, because I could categorize this statement alongside many others, such as one a few days later made by another of the acting teachers who exhorted his students, "Go look at the faces in the metro. You will not see a smile. Foreigners notice this all the time." Still, I remain skeptical that even the most reflexive ethnography attentive to the dynamics of interaction would go far enough. I remain unconvinced that in ethnography itself lies the solution. These conversations about Russian or anyone's capacity for intersubjective contact have been filtered through so many politically tinted lenses. And here, if I had time, I could go back and cite Montesquieu. If you recall Montesquieu in studying his experiments in cutting through taste buds to see which taste buds would open under which temperature, argued that because of the northern climate, quote unquote, if one wants to make a Muscovite feel pain, one would have to flay him alive. So these discourses go so far back, and they're so fraught that it remains to be understood, I think, why is it that into the 21st century they oscillate as they do? Why are they so fraught? One moment many describe Russians as a people closed up, and then the other as people capable of feeling more deeply, more collectively, more from the soul than any other. This ongoing tension, I think, is not peripheral and not just kind of para-affective, sentimental kind of extra discourse. And I think it's bound up with capacities for the fact that it's bound up in this way, I think it's caught up within a bundle of translocal competitions about, among other things, what are the loci of modernity. And I think in this, anthropology might have a lot to contribute because of its theoretical formulations of diversified and dispersed assemblages of knowledge and power, especially in post-colonial places. In any case, it's the very topic of contact rupture and suture affords a way to anchor founding claims to modernity. Narratives of exile from Eden, from particular narratives of exile to sociological accounts of enami. Belief in modernity is devoted to the gap. And these tropes, not coincidentally, run through European colonial forms of racialization, fears of touching, rule from a distance, nostalgia for lost nature. Historians of science have suggested that as humans came to depict molecules, bonds between molecules, atoms, subatomic particles at ever smaller scales, as if they expand and quaver and dissolve. So too, we've been depicting each other in ways that created new gaps. So note, for instance, that when Ibsen, Chekhov, and many others write characters that misinterpret each other, they begin to do so not because the angels have tangled them into comedies of error, not because of puns or double meanings, but because we seem to have discovered ourselves as ever reducible, living in worlds comprised of energies and particles that seem never to touch. Seem to have, though, it's a trope, it's an illusion. These gaps themselves are also imagined. But nevertheless, perhaps to seem to be ever inventing gaps between gaps to be crossed, and also then to be seen as perpetually solving them, to master these processes becomes a way to encompass modernity, to champion our own methods for sensing intersubjective contact and methods of surpassing, and doing this in ways that surpass what anyone else is doing. So for instance, this could be said to be the fame of Moscow, right? Through forms of artistic and other forms of intersubjective understanding. Now, I want to, for fun, and to sort of bring home the illusion of all of this, I want to show you a clip, a contrasting clip. If I have a minute, the clip would last about 2 minutes, okay? And I wanted to show you, and this comes from, part of my motivation in writing this comes from teaching American students and leading groups of tourists who insist on noticing this problem of the smile, this problem of affect, this gap between Russians and Americans, as if they're somehow noticing something real and then anchoring it to an imagined Stalinist past. But they never, for the record, notice that they notice the same thing when they go to Paris. And then they never make the connection that when they're in Paris, they blame it on civilité. They never notice that the question of the American smile or the purported American ability to make contact is itself ideologically constructed. So, in view of conclusion, I wanted to show you, if I could get back on the internet, which may not be here, I wanted to show you an example of American propaganda about contact, which shows, basically what this clip is trying to argue is that we don't have to worry about nuclear war with the Russians because we have mastered communication between ourselves so well that there are no gaps at all, and we are perfectly safe. We are safe, don't worry. And so this is a propaganda film which shows what's happening underground at Strategic Air Command when they receive the phone call from the president, and all this, the sort of fail-safes to make sure that the correct communication has occurred and there's not going to be any false alarm and there won't be any false war. But it's very funny if you watch, because on every scene as it moves through, all you see are gaps. There's no there. And in this case, it's imagined contact. I've been talking about imaginations of the gap. This is imagined contact. But it's very funny. And maybe I also thought I'd mention by way of passing that I grew up near this place in the heart of Nebraska, and it's underground. It's called Strategic Air Command. Nobody I know has ever seen it, been to it, can't get to it. The only person I know who's ever made contact with Strategic Air Command is this man here, who went there in the early 90s. So it's very interesting to me that you could go into this place and see it ethnographically, and I never could. So enjoy it. This is just a provocation.
What about the sound?
Микрофон, колонку поставь.
See what I'm saying? There's no Я пытаюсь заключать вопросы на русском. И на английском, как хотите. Слышно?
Переводить вопросы?
Нет, не надо, переводить не нужно.
Да, переходим к вопросам. So, let's turn to questions now. Да.
I just nothing, but we know from ethologists that human species is very often considered as non-contact species. And there is a kind of distinction between species that are really supporting direct contact and some not. For instance, birds are non-contact species except parrots, and so on. So there is a wonderful description in Eda's Canetti of this fear of being touched, which is so typical for human beings. When you are in a packed elevator, you feel how very uncomfortably somebody is really touching you. And this taboo on contact, which is, I think, universal taboo, is probably one, of course it's very different. Sometimes in intimate situations, this taboo is absolutely disappearing and you are striving for an absolutely direct bodily contact, which is quite clear. But in social situation, we are really not allowing this direct bodily contact, for instance. So I think that the whole system and richness of communication is emerging from this taboo on contact. So it's very difficult, in my opinion, just to deal with communication and contact in a very kind of linear way, because it's always a kind of, I don't like this word, but it's a dialectical relation between certain taboo and directness of contact and an extremely elaborated strategy of avoiding this contact that could be called communication in general. So this is why I think all these kind of talks about the directness of context, non-directness of context should be always corrected through the prism of very complex relation of taboos, detours, strategies or something like that. It's basically how I understand the whole situation where the whole discussion of contact, non-contact is always calling for this kind of complex analysis of taboo and strategies.
Это очень интересно. And in fact, my original paper was titled Fear of Contact. And of course you're speaking of bodily contact, right? But this is one reason I turn to semioticians such as Peirce, who believes that things do touch, but then they don't. And so what is interesting to me about what becomes the problem of contact for whom and when does not presuppose that there is always non-contact. We make these things up sometimes, but why? I think it's very interesting to think about when does fear of contact become operative for whom?
I think we will have 3 more questions, and that all because we are running a bit out of time. So first Aaron, okay, and then.
No, it's just a small detail, but no. This idea of this postmodernist sort of ontological commitment to rupture. I just wonder, the original idea of a gap or rupture between signifier and signified isn't that there's a kind of unbridgeable distance we never get from signifier to concept, but that actually the fact that there's a cut makes possible that there can be a communication. So for instance, the fact that I never understand what you really mean actually makes it possible that we can have some kind of dialogue or build a meaning. Because there is, we have a very good name for people for which there is no gap at all. They're paranoiacs. And you know, the clip you showed illustrates that very well. That in fact, the strategic command, the idea was to build a totally paranoiac kind of communication. And those wonderful stories you hear about a near nuclear war. Always that, you know, the miracle of that, the reason why it didn't happen is always somebody subjectivized in a very good neurotic way the change. So they said, really? Is there really going to be a launch? Like, maybe we shouldn't do this, instead of acting in a totally paranoid way.
Yes, especially the end of your statement, I think, and the fact that we might misunderstand ourselves. Whoa, and then it also tends, if you work backward, to deproblematize the question of understanding. If I don't even understand myself, who is this other who I think I'm misunderstanding, and are they really so separate? It starts to fall apart, and then I recall that if you look back to who is often cited as this father of structuralism, he never split signifier from signifier. They're one piece like this, right? For Saussure, it's a piece of paper that has, it's always connected. So after Saussure, the post-structuralists began to speak in these images of gap in a way that maybe they didn't always intend, but I think has become unproductive as a trope. But I agree that the way you set it out makes sense.
Thank you for your paper. I think there are really two topics involved. One is the gap and one is the contact. I don't think they have to go together all the time. First of all, the gap. I am convinced that modernity, it thrives on gaps. And let me give you just two examples. If you don't take the signifier bit, which of course is the linguistic term. So it's really that the world is no longer connected. We learned this morning, phenomenologists, the mind and the world are disconnected. This is very, very modernist thinking. Next one is Erfahrungsraum and Erwartungshorizont. This is a temporal gap, so there is no connection between past and future, for instance, or the gaps between the disciplines. So Ausdifferenzierung, differentiation of cultural spheres. All of this is part of modernist, development. So it all works through gaps. But when we come to contact, what is new now? It's new, very recent knowledge that we gained from neuroscience is that human beings are highly empathetic beings. They may lose this possibility already at the age of 17 months. They develop these empathetic signs, and at the moment when they become self-recognizable in the mirror, they also have this extended possibility of feeling empathy. Now, cultures can, of course, curb this drive, but it is part of the human potential, and it's part of the anthropological equipment.
I agree, and it's actually this возможность that I want to return to and be able to talk about without seeming mystical. And this is why I find Saussure, it's bankrotство Saussure. And so turning away from that understanding of language, and instead I would like some kind of hybrid, maybe of Jacobson, Peirce, but this sense of language that doesn't make a complete separation from symbolic body. So does that, just a continuation of this?
Now we'll run. And I'm sorry, Kevin, but this will be the last one because we are really, really pressed with time. We have another paper ahead and discussion. So
I was quite interested by your talk, and I think that the kind of empirical research that we do are very convergent. And I think that theater is a very important place to see the learning of this way to make commonality. And I have a story that I will not narrate because of time about Theater Dog, where there's some improvisation related to this issue you raised. But my question is about the understanding. I'm not sure to completely understand. What do you do with this observation of these different ways of touching or distancing or commenting on. For instance, when you were coming to the fact that American people could see French also distant as Russian, you say it is ideological. What do you mean here? What here will be the following analysis? Because for me, for instance, rather than general consideration about the difference between distance and tact, I would try to relate these concern with different engagement and to see whether in different construction of commonality these engagement are involved. So then it would not be only an issue of ideology, but an issue of practical making of commonality. So I was wondering whether, what do you do with this very nice, fascinating observations?
It's a very difficult question, and I probably agree with you that ideology can't go far enough. But I don't think either habituated habitus type answer, I don't know if that's what you mean, but a sort of engaged, because people can engage in working communication and yet come away with an understanding that would not be parsable as such. So I only have the negative answer, which is that ethnography considered alone as observation over time can't stop anyone from imposing these interpretations of closedness. So Kennan, despite all his time and interaction, nevertheless produced this account. So an ethnographer who would go somewhere and decide to interpret the emotional responses of Parisian people, without forms of engagement beyond the here and now, maybe they'll be textual / ideological, maybe they'll be embodied comparative, but it can't just be this one moment, or he'll just bring what he already knew, I think. I'm afraid it's no answer.
Thank you, Elena.